Wyoming Territory in late 1839 had drawn men west with promises of beaver pelts and freedom, but it extracted payment in hardship and isolation. James Crawford arrived in October with his new wife Elizabeth, called Lizzie by those who knew her well. They'd married in May at a trading post in Missouri, where Lizzie's father had given his blessing with obvious reluctance. His daughter was choosing a hard life in country that broke stronger women than she appeared to be. But Lizzie had grown up watching her mother manage a Pennsylvania farmhouse. Through winters that tested resolve, had learned that survival came from preparation and partners who pulled equal weight. She looked at Jim Crawford and saw someone who understood work, who didn't waste words or motion, whose hands showed the calluses of a man who built things to last. They arrived in the valley in early October with 2 pack horses supplies for winter and a letter of introduction to a trapper named Samuel Whitaker, who'd been in the territory for 5 years. Sam showed them a spot half a mile from his own cabin, high enough for good drainage, close enough to a creek for water, without being in the floodplain. Jim and Sam and 2 other trappers spent 5 days in mid-October building a cabin that measured 16 feet by 20 feet, using logs cut from the surrounding forest and notched at the corners in the traditional way. The walls went up quickly, each log fitted to the one below, with practiced efficiency. They chinked the gaps with moss and clay, mixed to a consistency that would harden as it dried. The roof was simple, angled to shed snow covered with split planks and layers of bark that would keep most weather out. A stone fireplace occupied the north wall built from river rock Sam helped them gather. One window faced south, covered with oiled paper that let light in while keeping most wind out. The floor was packed dirt hard from use, even though the cabin was new packed hard by their feet as they worked to finish before the first serious snow. The cabin was adequate. That word covered most aspects of mountain life in 1839. Adequate shelter, adequate food stores, adequate warmth. Luxury was for people in cities. Survival was the measure of success in wilderness, where winter meant 6 months of cold that never fully released its grip on the high country. Jim and Lizzie settled into routines that would carry them through. Jim ran trap lines in a circuit that took 3 days to complete, checking sets for beaver and fox, skinning what he caught, stretching pelts on frames to dry. Lizzie managed the cabin, cooking meals over the fireplace, mending clothes, curing meat, doing the 1,000 small tasks that kept a household functional when the nearest settlement was 2 days' ride away. The fireplace was the heart of everything. From late October through April, it burned constantly, a living thing that demanded feeding and attention. Jim rose before dawn each morning to add wood building up the fire before heading out to check traps. Lizzie tended it through the day, keeping flames going while she worked. At night, before sleep, Jim would load the firebox with the largest logs available, hoping they would burn long enough to keep the cabin livable until morning. Most nights they did. The cabin would stay tolerably warm, perhaps 50 degrees by dawn, cold enough to see breath, but not cold enough to freeze water left in a bucket. But maintaining that temperature required the fire to keep burning. If the logs burned through too quickly, if the wood was damp and smoldered instead of flaming, if any of a dozen variables went wrong, the cabin would lose heat rapidly. They managed through their first winter together. The cold was real and constant, but predictable. They learned its rhythms, learned how much wood kept the fire burning through the night, learned which spots in the cabin stayed warmest. Lizzie proved as capable as Jim had judged her to be. She never complained about the cold or the isolation or the endless work. When the last snow melted in late April and the valley began its brief transformation into green country, they'd survived their first test. Spring brought relief, then summer with its own challenges of preserving food and preparing for the next cold season. Autumn arrived again in September, leaves turning gold on the aspens, nights growing crisp. By October 1840, they felt prepared. They had learned the rhythms of survival. The cold was manageable. That confidence would not survive December. The month arrived with temperatures that made the previous winter seem mild. The cold settled into the valley like something with weight and presence, pushing down from the mountains to the north, finding every crack and gap in every structure. Mornings began at 20 below zero. By midday, if the sun emerged, temperatures might climb to 10 below. At night, they plummeted further. At those temperatures, exposed skin froze in minutes. Breath crystallized instantly. Wood became brittle and difficult to split. The cold found weakness everywhere, testing construction and preparation and human endurance with relentless pressure. Lizzie fell ill on December 8th. It began as a cough that seemed minor at first, the kind of thing that came and went in mountain country, where weather changed quickly and work continued regardless of minor ailments. But within 2 days, the cough had deepened and fever set in. Her body temperature spiked, while outside the cabin, evening temperatures dropped toward 30 below. Jim kept the fire burning hot, trying to warm the space enough to help the fever break. He boiled water to create steam. He wrapped Lizzie in every blanket they owned, layers of wool and fur piled on their sleeping platform. He stayed awake monitoring both his wife and the fire feeding wood into the flames, trying to maintain heat that would help her body fight whatever infection had taken hold. The human body requires sleep. This is not a matter of preference or willpower. After a certain point, consciousness simply shuts down regardless of need or desire. Jim had been awake for nearly 38 hours on the night of December 10th. He sat beside the fire, feeding split pine into the flames, watching Lizzie's labored breathing from across the cabin. Her forehead burned when he touched it, skin hot and dry, despite the blankets soaked with sweat beneath her. Around 2 in the morning, he added what he thought would be enough wood to last until dawn. Large, split logs pine that had been drying since summer, ready to burn, long and steady. He allowed himself to close his eyes for just a moment, just long enough to rest them, telling himself he'd open them again in a few minutes. He woke to gray light filtering through the oiled paper window and cold that hit him like a physical force. The fire was dead. Not reduced to coals that could be revived with kindling and patience, but completely cold the way a fire gets when it's been out for hours. The logs he'd added had been smaller than he'd realized in his exhausted state, or perhaps the wood had been damper than it appeared. They'd burned through completely while he slept. The cabin temperature had dropped throughout the remaining night hours, heat escaping through gaps in the chinking, through the thin window covering through the dirt floor that provided no insulation from frozen ground beneath. Frost covered the inside of the walls in delicate patterns. The water bucket near the door had frozen solid ice, expanding upward in a dome. Jim moved to Lizzie immediately, his body stiff from sleeping, sitting up, his mind struggling through the fog of exhausted awakening. She was not breathing. Her skin felt cold when he touched her cheek, cold in a way that had nothing to do with the cabin temperature. The fever that had burned through her body for 2 days had weakened her enough that when the temperature dropped, her body could not maintain the fight. She had died sometime in the hours between his collapse into sleep and dawn, quietly without waking him, without crying out. The cold had simply taken her while he slept, 3 feet away, while the fire he'd promised to tend died down to nothing. Jim sat beside her body for an hour, not moving, not thinking clearly. His mind kept circling back to the same moment, kept seeing himself add those logs to the fire, kept telling himself they would be enough. Enough, that word again. Adequate. Sufficient. The words that described everything about frontier life, the words that now tasted like ash in his mouth. He had been adequate at tending the fire, adequate at caring for his sick wife, adequate right up until the moment adequate became not enough, and not enough became death. He stood finally and walked outside into the brutal morning air. The sun was rising over the eastern ridge, bright and utterly indifferent to what had happened in the small cabin below. Smoke rose from neighboring cabins where fires had successfully burned through the night. Life continued in those structures. Families would wake. Children would eat breakfast. The day would proceed normally. Jim walked back inside. He needed to build a fire. He needed to thaw the ground enough to dig a grave. He needed to do many things. But first he simply stood in the cabin that had failed to protect his wife, feeling the cold that had killed her, understanding with absolute clarity that adequate was not enough. Sam Whitaker and 2 other neighbors helped dig the grave 3 days later. The ground had been frozen solid down past 2 feet. Jim spent the first 2 days building fires on the burial site he'd chosen, a hillside overlooking the valley where Lizzie had liked to sit in the evenings. He'd build a fire, let it burn down to coals, scrape away the ash, then build another. Slowly the earth thawed enough to work. The men dug in shifts, pickaxes breaking frozen soil shovels, moving it aside. They lowered Lizzie's body wrapped in canvas into the frozen ground. They covered her with earth and stones. They stood silently for a few minutes and respect Sam, with his hat in his hands, the other men doing the same. Then they returned to their own cabins and their own struggles to survive the winter. Jim returned to his empty cabin. The fire was burning. He'd kept it fed continuously since the morning Lizzie died, as if making up for the failure. The space was warm, perhaps 65 degrees comfortable by any standard. But the warmth felt temporary, fragile, dependent entirely on his constant attention and the continued burning of wood in the firebox. He began to notice things he'd never paid attention to before. How quickly heat escaped through gaps in the chinking where clay had dried and cracked. How cold air seeped in around the doorframe despite his efforts to seal it. How the dirt floor remained perpetually cold regardless of how hot the fire burned, coldness radiating upward from frozen earth that stayed frozen 6 months of the year. Heat rose to the ceiling where it accumulated uselessly while the lower half of the cabin stayed cool. The single window, even covered with oiled paper, radiated cold inward like an open door. The entire structure was designed to lose heat, not retain it. Most men who lost wives on the frontier either remarried quickly or left the mountains entirely. The territory was hard on women and harder on men who tried to manage alone. Jim did neither. He stayed in the cabin through the remainder of that winter, trapping enough to maintain his supplies, but spending most of his time thinking about a single question. Why did cabins have to lose all their heat the moment a fire went out? It seemed like a simple question. The answer seemed obvious. Fire produces heat. When fire stops, heat stops. That was simply how things worked, the natural order, the way the world functioned. But Jim could not accept that answer. He had watched his wife die because of it. The knowledge that careful fire management was not sufficient, that a single mistake or moment of exhaustion could be fatal, made the standard answer unacceptable. He started paying attention to how different materials held or released heat. Metal tools left near the fire stayed warm for a few minutes after being moved away, then cooled rapidly. Stone around the fireplace stayed warm much longer, sometimes for an hour or more after the fire died down. Wood held almost no heat at all. Water in a pot would stay hot for a while, but eventually it too cooled. Everything released its heat to the surrounding air. Everything equalized to the ambient temperature eventually. But the rates differed, and that difference felt important. Some materials released heat quickly, others slowly. Some seemed to absorb heat and hold it. If a cabin could be built using materials that absorbed and held heat during the day, could that heat be released slowly through the night? Could a structure be designed not just to contain heat from an active fire, but to store it and release it gradually? The question occupied Jim's thoughts through January and February. He had no formal education in physics or engineering. He'd grown up on a Missouri farm learning practical carpentry from his father, but nothing about the science of heat transfer. What he had was time, motivation, and the ability to observe carefully. He started keeping notes in a journal Lizzie had used for household accounts, her neat handwriting on the early pages giving way to his rougher script. Metal cools in 5 minutes. Stone holds warmth 1 hour. Floor always cold, even near fire. He filled pages with observations that would have seemed meaningless to anyone else but were pieces of a puzzle he was trying to assemble. Spring arrived slowly in the high country. March brought temperatures above freezing during daylight hours, though nights remained bitter. Snow began to melt on south-facing slopes. Creeks swelled with runoff water, brown and fast-moving. The valley started its gradual transition from frozen stillness to mud and emerging life. Jim's food stores were running low by late March. He'd been trapping minimally through the winter, focused more on his observations about heat than on building up furs to sell. Now he needed supplies. Sam Whitaker lived 2 miles south in a cabin slightly larger than Jim's. Sam had a wife and 3 children. He also had a root cellar, a substantial one, dug 8 feet into a hillside behind his cabin. Jim knew Sam stored potatoes, turnips, carrots, and other vegetables there through the winter. In late March, with his own supplies depleted, Jim rode to Sam's cabin to see if he could trade furs for food to last until he could travel to the trading post in April. Sam agreed readily. Times were hard for everyone coming out of a brutal winter, but Sam had planned well and could spare some vegetables. He led Jim to the root cellar and pulled open the heavy wooden door set into the hillside. The 2 men descended crude stone steps into the underground chamber. The space was perhaps 10 feet square and 7 feet high at the center, with a curved ceiling following the excavated earth above. Wooden shelves lined the walls, holding barrels and crates of stored food. What struck Jim immediately was the temperature. Outside, the morning air was perhaps 35 degrees. Inside the cabin with a fire burning, it would be 60 or 65. But in the root cellar, the temperature felt somewhere between those extremes. Not warm, but not cold. Jim guessed around 45 or 50 degrees. Stable. comfortable enough that he didn't need to button his coat, though he'd fastened it against the outdoor chill. Stays like this all winter. Sam began moving aside crates to access a barrel of potatoes. Never freezes, never gets warm. Good for keeping vegetables from rotting or freezing. Jim barely heard him. His mind was working through the implications of what he was experiencing. The earth itself was maintaining a stable temperature. The root cellar had no fire. It had no active heating source. Yet it stayed warmer than the outside air in winter and would stay cooler than the outside air in summer. The mass of earth surrounding the space was acting as insulation and temperature regulator simultaneously. Heat from deeper in the earth from below the frost line where ground never froze was slowly migrating upward. The thick earthen walls prevented that heat from escaping rapidly. The result was a space that maintained equilibrium, hovering around 45 or 50 degrees, regardless of what the outside temperature did. Jim helped Sam carry potatoes and turnips out to his horse. He paid with beaver pelts and rode home. But his mind was not on the food. He was thinking about earth and temperature stability, about mass and insulation, about the possibility that a cabin built with some portion of its structure underground might benefit from the same principles that kept Sam's root cellar from freezing. Most cabins were built entirely above ground. That was standard practice. It was faster, easier, and seemed logical. But what if a cabin could incorporate underground elements? What if the floor could somehow be connected to the stable temperature of Earth below the frost line? The idea was forming, still vague, but connected to his earlier observations about materials holding heat at different rates. Stone held heat longer than wood or metal. Earth maintained stable temperature better than air. If those two principles could be combined somehow, if a cabin could have a stone foundation that absorbed heat, like the stones around a fireplace, and if that foundation could be insulated from the frozen surface layer of Earth, the way a root cellar was insulated by deep soil, then maybe the system could store heat during the day and release it slowly through the night. April brought Jim to the trading post settlement 40 miles east. The journey took 2 days on horseback, following established trails that were finally clear of deep snow. He carried his winter's accumulation of beaver pelts, fewer than a successful season would produce, but enough to trade for supplies. Coffee, salt powder, lead flour, the essentials that could not be produced or gathered in the mountains. The settlement consisted of a trading post, a blacksmith shop, a small general store, and a sawmill positioned beside a fast-flowing creek. The mill was a recent addition built 2 years earlier by a man named Robert Miller, who'd recognized that the growing number of settlers and miners in the region needed cut lumber. Jim completed his trading at the post, then walked to the sawmill. He had no specific business there, but the sound of the blade cutting through logs drew his attention. Bob Miller was working alone, guiding a large pine log through the vertical blade driven by a water wheel. The air was thick with the smell of fresh-cut wood and filled with sawdust that hung in shafts of sunlight streaming through gaps in the walls. Jim watched for a while, then began looking at the waste material accumulating around the mill. Sawdust formed enormous piles where Bob shoveled it away from the blade. Wood shavings from planing operations created smaller piles of curled thin strips. Most of this material was simply discarded or occasionally used as bedding for livestock. It had no commercial value. It was the inevitable byproduct of turning logs into boards. What caught Jim's attention was steam rising from one of the older piles. The spring morning was cool, perhaps 45 degrees, yet visible vapor rose from sawdust that had been accumulating for months. Jim walked over and thrust his hand into the pile. 6 inches below the surface, the sawdust was warm. Not hot, but noticeably warmer than the surrounding air. He dug deeper. A foot down, the material was quite warm, almost uncomfortable to hold. Bob noticed his interest and walked over, wiping sweat from his forehead. It does that. The piles heat themselves. Something about the wood breaking down inside. I've seen them steam, even in winter. Jim pulled his hand out and examined the sawdust clinging to his skin. The material was fine, almost powder-like in the oldest sections, dry despite the moisture that must be produced by whatever decomposition process was occurring inside. Does it ever catch ear? Not that I've seen. Just stays warm like a blanket that makes its own heat. Bob shrugged. It's good for nothing except hauling away. You want some, you can have all you can carry. Jim stood looking at the pile for a long time. Something about this material, about its ability to trap and hold heat, seemed important. He thought about the root cellar's stable temperature, about Earth holding warmth, about materials that absorbed and released heat slowly. Sawdust was light, easy to transport, and apparently capable of insulating heat effectively. The decomposition process was generating warmth, but even without that, the material's structure, all those tiny wood particles creating countless small air spaces, would trap heat the way a blanket trapped body warmth. I might take you up on that. Jim didn't explain why. He wasn't sure himself yet. But another piece of something larger was falling into place. The blacksmith shop stood 50 yards from the sawmill, a stone structure with a slate roof and wide doors that stood open to ventilate the heat from the forge. Jim could feel warmth radiating from the building as he approached. Thomas Hayes had been the settlement's blacksmith for 5 years, serving the scattered population of trappers, miners, and settlers who needed tools repaired, horses shod, or metal hardware fabricated. Jim entered and found Tom working on a set of hinges, heating iron bars in the forge until they glowed orange, then hammering them into shape on his anvil. The ring of metal on metal filled the space. Sparks scattered with each impact. The forge itself was built from carefully fitted stones that formed a deep firebox with a chimney rising through the roof. Tom finished the piece he was working on and plunged it into a water trough. Steam erupted with a sharp hiss. He noticed Jim and nodded in greeting. "Needs something made." "Not today, just watching." Jim moved closer to the forge. The fire had burned down after Tom's last heating, reduced to glowing coals but no longer flaming. Yet the heat radiating from the structure was intense. Jim could feel it on his face from 6 feet away. "That's a well-built forge." Tom wiped his hands on his leather apron. "Took me 2 months to build it right. The stones are everything. They have to fit tight, no gaps for heat to escape, and they have to be thick. These are 8 inches at least, some places 12. How long does it stay hot after the fire dies? Hours. I can bank the coals at end of the day, go home, come back next morning, and the stones are still warm enough to hurt if you touch them wrong. Sometimes I can restart the fire just from the heat they held overnight." Jim walked around the forge, studying its construction. The stones were dark gray, probably granite from the surrounding mountains. They were fitted together with minimal mortar, relying on their flat surfaces and weight to create stability. The thermal mass was enormous, hundreds of pounds of stone. They were all absorbing heat throughout the day as Tom worked. Does it matter what kind of stone? Tom thought about this. Dense stone is better. Soft stone cracks from the heat. Granite works. Basalt is good if you can find it. Anything heavy and solid. He poked at the coals with an iron rod. The heavier the stone, the more heat it holds. My father taught me that back in Massachusetts. A good forge is built from stone that remembers the fire. That phrase lodged in Jim's mind like a key turning in a lock. Stone that remembers the fire. The stones were absorbing thermal energy and releasing it slowly over time. The mass acted as a battery, storing heat and discharging it gradually. This was the same principle he'd been observing in different forms. The root cellar's earth mass maintaining stable temperature. The sawmill's sawdust pile holding warmth. Now the forge stones. All of them held heat far longer than wood or air or any of the materials typically used in cabin construction. Jim stayed at the settlement for 3 days, sleeping in a corner of the trading post and spending his daylight hours thinking, sketching crude drawings with charcoal on scraps of bark, asking careful questions of anyone who might have relevant knowledge. By the time he left for home, the core of an idea had formed. It was rough, lacking specific details, but the fundamental concept was clear. He needed to build a cabin that incorporated 3 distinct layers working together to capture, store, and release heat. The first layer would be stone. Heavy stone foundations, not just simple cornerstones, but actual walls built underground or at ground level, forming a perimeter that could absorb heat from the cabin's fire. These stones would act like Tom's forge, holding thermal energy and releasing it slowly over many hours. The second layer would be insulation. Sawdust wood shavings, perhaps mixed with other materials, filling the space between the stone foundation and the cabin floor. This layer would prevent heat from escaping downward into the frozen earth. It would trap the warmth radiating from the stones and prevent it from dissipating uselessly. The third layer would be the floor itself. Not a simple dirt floor like his current cabin had, but a proper wooden floor, thick planks that would absorb warmth from below and radiate it upward into the living space. The floor would be warm to walk on, warm to sleep on, maintaining livable temperature even hours after the fire died. The system would work in sequence. Fire heats the cabin and the stone foundation. Stones absorb and hold that heat. Insulation traps it. Wooden floor distributes it upward into the living space. The structure would not need constant fire. It would coast on stored heat, releasing it gradually through the night, maintaining temperature that would keep a person alive, even if the fire went out, even if exhaustion or illness prevented constant vigilance, even if everything went wrong. Jim knew the concept would seem insane to anyone he described it to. Mountain men built cabins quickly using minimal materials. They accepted that fires had to burn constantly. They did not dig elaborate foundations or fill cavities with sawdust or build raised wooden floors. His design would take 10 times longer to construct than a normal cabin. It would require materials that seemed unnecessary. It would look strange, overbuilt, wasteful. But Jim did not care about the opinions of others. He cared about building a shelter that would not fail the way his previous cabin had failed. A structure that could protect its occupant even if the fire died, even if exhaustion or illness prevented constant vigilance, even if everything went wrong. The cabin would stay warm enough to sustain life. He would build it to hold heat the way stone held fire, to maintain warmth, the way earth maintained stable temperature, to work when he couldn't. And he would build it in memory of a woman who'd frozen to death 3 feet from a man who'd loved her, but whose love had not been enough to keep her alive. Jim arrived back at his valley in late April and began preparing for construction. He had the entire summer to build, and he would need every week of it. The site he selected was half a mile from his current cabin on a slight rise with good drainage and clear sight lines. The spot was less convenient to water, requiring a longer walk to the creek, but it offered advantages his old location lacked. High ground meant no flooding during spring runoff. The rise provided natural air circulation. Most importantly, it gave him space to work without constant questions from neighbors passing his current cabin. He began by clearing the site of brush and small trees, swinging an axe through saplings and brambles, until he had a rectangle of open ground. Then he marked out the cabin's footprint using stakes and cords 16 feet by 20 feet, the same dimensions as his previous structure. But instead of simply laying cornerstones and beginning to stack logs, Jim started digging. He excavated a trench around the entire perimeter 2 feet deep and 18 inches wide. The work was brutal in ways that went beyond physical effort. Mountain soil was rocky, full of roots, and still partially frozen in shaded areas. He worked alone, using a pickaxe to break up compacted earth and a shovel to remove it. The pickaxe rang against stones buried in soil, the impact traveling up Jim's arms and into his shoulders with each swing. His hands, already calloused from years of trapline work, developed new calluses in different places. Blisters formed and broke and formed again. The trench progressed slowly, maybe 4 or 5 feet per day, when the digging was good, less when he hit patches of frozen ground or dense root systems. He worked from first light until he couldn't see me anymore, then returned to his old cabin to eat and sleep before starting again the next morning. Sam Whitaker rode past in early June and stopped to watch. Jim was waist-deep in the trench on the north side, throwing shovel loads of dirt and rocks onto a growing pile. Sam sat on his horse for several minutes before speaking, his expression mixing curiosity with something that might have been concern. "You building a cabin or a grave foundation? That's deeper than any foundation needs to be. You planning to build 2 stories, 1 story, but it needs to be right." Sam shook his head slowly, his horse shifting beneath him. "Wasting time, Jim. A cabin needs cornerstones, maybe a few flat rocks to keep the bottom logs off the ground. You're digging like you're making a root cellar. Maybe that's part of it." Part of what Jim didn't answer. He picked up his shovel and returned to the trench, driving the blade into soil with a force that suggested the conversation was finished. Sam watched for another minute, then rode on. That evening, he told his wife Ruth about Jim's strange excavation. Within days, other neighbors had ridden past to see for themselves. The consensus was that grief had affected Jim's judgment. Digging an elaborate foundation for a simple cabin made no sense. It was wasted effort that could be spent trapping, hunting, or preparing for the next winter. Jim ignored the comments and continued digging. By mid-June, he had completed the perimeter trench. It formed a perfect rectangle, 2 feet deep, uniform width, with a level bottom. He had removed approximately 6 tons of earth and rock, pile after pile of material that now formed small hills around his construction site. A normal cabin foundation would have required moving perhaps 200 pounds of stone for corner supports. Jim had moved 60 times that amount just to create empty space. And he was just beginning. The next phase required stone, not small rocks, but substantial pieces of granite and basalt from the surrounding mountainsides. He spent 2 weeks gathering them using a travois pulled by his horse to haul loads from a rocky outcrop a mile away. Each stone was selected for flatness and density. Light porous stone was rejected. He wanted heavy material that would hold heat the way Tom Hayes' forge did dense rock that would absorb thermal energy and release it slowly. The work was monotonous and exhausting. Ride to the outcrop, select stones, load them onto the travois, lead the horse back, unload, repeat. Some days he managed 4 trips. Other days, when he found particularly good stones, he might make only 2 trips because the weight was too much for more. By early July, Jim had accumulated enough stone to begin construction. He started laying the foundation walls, working from the bottom of his excavated trench upward. Each stone was positioned carefully fitted against its neighbors to minimize gaps. He used minimal mortar, just enough clay-based mud to fill spaces between stones, relying primarily on the weight and friction of properly fitted pieces to create stability. The foundation walls rose slowly, inch by inch, day by day. Jim worked methodically, checking level, constantly rejecting stones that didn't fit properly, sometimes spending an hour positioning a single large piece. The walls were 18 inches thick, far more substantial than necessary for structural support. A cabin the size Jim was building could rest on walls 6 inches thick without any stability problems. But thermal mass required thickness. The more stone, the more heat it could absorb and store. Other trappers continued to stop and watch as they passed. The reactions ranged from puzzlement to open mockery. Bob Miller, the sawmill owner, rode past in mid-July and spent 20 minutes examining the work, walking around the perimeter of rising stone walls with hands on his hips. You building a fortress, expecting a war. Just a cabin. That's not how cabins are built. Those walls are thick enough for a trading post. You're wasting stone and time. Bob watched longer, then shook his head with the finality of a man who'd seen enough foolishness for one day. Your choice. But winter comes whether you're ready or not. A man who spends all summer on foundations won't have time to build walls and roof. The comment reflected a real concern that Jim had calculated carefully in his planning. Standard cabin construction took less than a week with help, maybe 2 weeks working alone. Jim had already spent 6 weeks just on excavation and foundation work. He had not yet placed a single log for the actual cabin walls. At his current pace, he might not finish before snow arrived in October. An incomplete cabin was worse than no cabin at all, offering neither shelter nor the warmth of the old cabin he'd eventually have to abandon. But Jim had done the mathematics in his head, counting days and tasks. The foundation work was the most labor-intensive phase. Once the stone walls were complete and the cavity filled with insulation, the actual cabin construction would proceed relatively quickly. He would have walls and roof before October. It would be tight, the margin for error small, but achievable if he didn't get hurt and the weather held. By the first week of August, the foundation walls were complete. They rose 18 inches above ground level, forming a raised perimeter around the cabin footprint. The interior space was now a rectangular pit 2 feet deep from original ground level to the top of the stone walls. This created a cavity with stone walls on all sides and earth at the bottom. The cavity measured roughly 13 feet by 17 feet interior dimensions, accounting for the wall thickness. Standing inside this space, looking up at ground level 2 feet above the structure, looked absurd. It resembled an empty swimming pool or an oversized grave marker. Several neighbors who saw it laughed openly. Sam Whitaker brought his oldest son, Tommy, to see what he called Jim's folly. They stood at the edge looking down at Jim, working inside, and Sam explained to his son how not to build a cabin using Jim's construction as an object lesson in wasted effort. See how deep he's dug? See how thick those walls are. All that work for nothing that matters. A cabin just needs to keep rain and snow out. These walls are 3 times thicker than they need to be. Tommy, 10 years old and curious in the way of children, asked the question his father didn't. Why's he doing it, Pa? Grief makes men do strange things, son. Mr. Crawford lost his wife last winter. Sometimes when people hurt that bad, they stop thinking clear. Jim said nothing during this exchange, though he was close enough to hear every word. He had known this reaction would come. People judged based on what they understood. They understood log cabins built quickly on simple foundations. They did not understand thermal mass or heat storage or the physics of why his design would work. Their mockery did not change the principles he was building on. Stone absorbed heat. Insulation trapped it. A raised floor could distribute warmth. Those facts remained true regardless of how many people laughed. With the stone foundation complete, Jim began the next phase. He needed a support structure for the floor, something strong enough to bear weight, but designed to allow heat from the stones to radiate upward into the insulating layer he would install above. The solution was a joist system similar to what builders used in proper houses back east, adapted for his specific requirements. He selected logs for joists with the same care he'd use for foundation stones. Each log needed to be straight, approximately 8 inches in diameter, and long enough to span the 20-foot width of the cabin. He rejected logs with excessive taper or visible rot. Over 2 weeks, he cut and hauled 14 logs that met his standards. Each one was debarked completely using a draw knife, tedious work that left his forearms burning and his hands cramped. Then he shaped the contact surfaces to ensure flat bearing on the stone walls using a hatchet and adze to create level planes where the joists would rest. The joists were positioned 16 inches apart, running parallel across the short dimension of the cabin. They rested directly on the stone foundation walls, creating a grid of support beams with open space between them. Jim notched each joist where it met the stone, creating a positive lock that prevented shifting. But securing them properly required wooden pegs, dowels that would pin each joist to the stone walls and keep everything locked in place. He needed approximately 10 pegs per joist, 140 pegs total. The trading post sold wooden pegs, but at a cost that would consume most of his remaining funds. Jim sat by his campfire one evening in mid-August, calculating. He could ride to the trading post 2 days there and 2 days back, spend his money on pegs, and return to continue work. That was 4 days lost to travel, or he could make the pegs himself from birch, which was harder and stronger than pine. Making them would take a week, maybe more, working into the evenings after his regular construction hours. But he'd save the money and have better pegs. He chose to make them. For 6 days he worked until he couldn't see any more, shaping birch dowels by firelight, creating pegs that fit snugly in the holes he'd drilled through the joists. His hands developed new blisters over the old calluses. His back ached from hunching over the work. But by the end of the 6th day, he had 140 pegs, each one tested for fit, each one capable of bearing the weight it would need to support. He drove them into place over 2 days, using a wooden mallet to pound each peg through the joist and into cracks he'd carved in the stone walls with a chisel. The result was a rigid framework that could support substantial weight, a floor platform elevated 2 feet above the original ground level. Sam visited again in late August and walked across the joist system, testing it with his weight. His boots made solid sounds on the wood. The structure didn't flex or give. He had to admit the craftsmanship was excellent, even if the overall design remained baffling. You're building a stage. That floor is going to be 2 feet off the ground. You'll need steps to get into your own cabin. Probably. Why, what's the purpose of all this empty space underneath insulation? Insulation from what? The ground. The ground doesn't need insulating. It's just there. Jim didn't try to explain further. The concept of ground temperature affecting cabin warmth was not something most trappers considered. They built on the ground because that was where the ground was solid and stable and available. The idea that earth below frost line maintained stable temperature, or that frozen surface soil could drain heat from a cabin faster than fire could produce it, was not part of common knowledge. Jim had learned it through observation and thought, connecting pieces that others hadn't thought to connect. Explaining it to someone who had not made those observations would require more time and patience than he wanted to invest. It'll make sense when it's done. Sam rode away shaking his head, and that evening he told several neighbors that Jim was building the strangest cabin anyone had ever seen, and it probably wouldn't even work properly when finished. The spacing and design of the joist system drew more questions from visitors. 16-inch joist spacing was excessive for a simple cabin floor. Standard construction used joists 24 or even 30 inches apart. Closer spacing meant more logs, more work, more weight. But Jim wanted a floor that would not flex or sag under use, and he wanted the joist positioned to allow maximum airflow between them for heat distribution. With the joists in place, the cavity beneath the future floor was now divided into 13 long channels, each 16 inches wide and 2 feet deep. These channels ran the full length of the cabin. From above, looking down between the joists, the stone foundation was visible at the bottom, with 2 feet of empty space between the stones and where the floor would eventually sit. September brought the need to fill that cavity. Jim had been planning this phase since his visit to Bob Miller's sawmill in April. He returned to the settlement with his horse and a large canvas tarp he'd sewn together from smaller pieces. Bob was surprised to see him loading sawdust and wood shavings into bags fashioned from old flour sacks. "You're taking my waste if you don't need it. I've got piles of it. Been meaning to haul it away. You're doing me a favor." Bob helped load the bags onto Jim's travois, still shaking his head in confusion. "What's it for insulation?" Bob looked at the fine sawdust, the curled shavings, the mix of refuse from months of mill operation. "That's garbage. It rots. It attracts mice. You're going to insulate with garbage. We'll see." Jim made 6 trips over 2 weeks, hauling approximately 400 pounds of material each time. The work was dusty and dirty sawdust getting into his clothes and hair, wood shavings clinging to everything. At the cabin site, he also gathered other materials. Dried moss from the north sides of trees, naturally resistant to decay. Pine needles which resisted rot better than most organic material. Charcoal from old fire pits crushed into small pieces with a rock. He mixed everything together in proportions he could only guess at: roughly half sawdust and shavings, a quarter pine needles, and moss, a quarter charcoal. The mixture served multiple purposes that Jim had reasoned through during his winter observations. Sawdust provided bulk and trapped air in countless tiny spaces, each pocket of air acting as an insulator. Pine needles added structure and resisted compression, maintaining those air spaces even under the weight of the floor above. Charcoal absorbed moisture and prevented rot, keeping the organic materials dry. Moss filled gaps and added another layer of air-trapping texture. The combination created an insulating material unlike anything used in standard construction, but based on principles Jim believed were sound. Neighbors who saw him spreading this mixture into the cavity beneath his cabin floor were openly incredulous. Sam stood at the edge, watching Jim shovel the material between the joists, filling the channels from stone foundation up to the underside of where floor planks would eventually sit. "You're building your cabin on a compost pile. On joists. The fill is just insulation. It's going to rot. It's going to smell. Mice are going to nest in it. Come spring, you'll have the biggest mouse den in Wyoming under your floor." Jim continued shoveling, spreading the insulating mixture evenly across the cavity. "The charcoal will discourage mice. The depth will prevent easy access." He didn't argue beyond that. He simply worked, packing the mixture down slightly, but not compressing it too much. Compressed insulation lost its air spaces, and air was what trapped heat. The mixture needed to be settled enough to stay in place, but loose enough to maintain its structure. By late September, the entire cavity was filled. 2 feet of mixed organic insulation sat between the stone foundation and the joist system. The stone walls rose above this fill, creating a raised platform that looked increasingly bizarre as the structure developed. From the outside, the cabin site looked like nothing anyone had seen before. Stone walls forming a rectangle at ground level, joists spanning across them, and the interior filled with what appeared to be decomposing forest floor material. Several trappers passing through the valley stopped to look. Most assumed Jim had lost his mind. One suggested openly that grief over Lizzie's death had broken something in him, turned his thoughts inward in ways that weren't healthy. Another offered to help him build a proper cabin before winter, suggesting they could have a functional structure completed in a week if Jim would abandon his current project and work with them on something sensible. Jim declined politely. He was too far committed to stop now. October arrived with cold nights and snow flurries that dusted the ground white each morning before melting by noon. Jim worked longer days, aware that winter was approaching faster than his construction schedule allowed. The floor installation was critical and could not be rushed. He had purchased milled planks from Bob Miller's sawmill during one of his sawdust hauling trips. The planks were 2 inches thick, 8 inches wide, and cut from dense pine. They were expensive by frontier standards, costing the equivalent of 2 months of trapping income. But Jim needed dimensional lumber, not rough-hewn logs. He needed pieces that would fit together tightly and create a solid surface. He laid the planks perpendicular to the joist, creating a floor surface that ran the length of the cabin. Each plank was fitted carefully against its neighbor gaps no wider than 1/8 of an inch. He used square-cut nail to secure the planks to the joists, driving 3 nails into each joist at every plank crossing. The work required precision. Each nail had to be driven straight to avoid splitting the wood. Each plank had to be positioned exactly before nailing to maintain the pattern. Jim worked slowly, measuring twice, nailing once, creating a floor that would not squeak or flex under use. But he added a feature that made this floor unique. Every eighth plank was not nailed permanently. Instead, he attached these planks using wooden pegs that could be removed, allowing the plank to be lifted like a hinged door. This created access panels to the insulating cavity beneath. The panels were invisible when closed, appearing identical to the rest of the floor, but they could be opened for inspection or maintenance. The floor sat exactly 2 feet above the original ground level. Standing inside the cabin footprint, a person's feet were now on a wooden platform elevated on stone walls and insulated beneath by 2 feet of mixed organic material. It looked and felt strange to anyone who climbed up onto it. Most cabin floors were at ground level, or perhaps 6 inches above on simple stone supports. Jim's floor was high enough that entering the cabin would require a step up, almost like stepping onto a stage or platform. Sam visited in mid-October and walked across the completed floor. His boots made solid sounds on the thick planks. The floor did not give or flex under his weight. It was level and well-built, demonstrating craftsmanship that couldn't be denied. But the height bothered him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. "You'll freeze in winter, cold air sinks. Your floor is up high, but the cold will pour underneath. That space below will be like an icebox. The stone walls are enclosed. Cold air can't get under the floor." Sam knelt and looked at the perimeter where floor met stone walls. Jim had indeed sealed the gap with clay mixed with horsehair and pine resin, the same mixture Sam had seen used for chinking between logs on well-built cabins. The seal looked tight, carefully applied, thick enough to prevent air movement. Even so, all that empty space underneath will be cold, and whatever you filled it with will just make it worse once moisture gets in. Jim didn't respond to the prediction. The entire point of his design was that the space underneath would not be cold. The stone foundation would absorb heat from the cabin's fire during the day. That heat would radiate into the insulating layer, warming the sawdust mixture and the air spaces within it. The insulation would prevent the heat from escaping into the frozen ground below. The floor would warm from below, heated by the thermal mass beneath it, rather than just by air heated from the fireplace. But explaining this to someone who had not thought through the physics seemed pointless. Sam would not believe it until he experienced it, and Jim had stopped trying to convince anyone of anything. The cabin would work or it wouldn't. Words meant nothing compared to results. November came with serious, cold night temperatures dropping into the teens, frost forming on grass that crunched underfoot. Jim worked frantically to complete the cabin walls and roof. The walls went up relatively quickly once he started. He used traditional notched log construction for speed, though he fitted each log more carefully than was standard practice. Each piece was selected for straightness and minimal taper. Each notch was cut precisely so logs locked together without gaps. The chinking was applied thickly, packed into every space between logs, smoothed on both interior and exterior surfaces. The roof was simple by necessity. He didn't have time for elaborate construction. A basic angled design would shed snow covered with split planks and multiple layers of bark that overlapped like shingles. It would not win any awards for appearance, but it was functional and weatherproof. The chimney required more care. Jim built it into the north wall using the same careful stone selection he had used for the foundation. Dense granite pieces fitted together with minimal mortar, creating a flue that would draw smoke efficiently and stones that would absorb heat from the fire. By the 3rd week of November, the cabin was enclosed, door installed and hung on iron hinges he'd purchased at the trading post. Windows shuttered with thick planks that could be opened for light or closed for warmth. Fireplace built and ready for use. The interior was rough and unfinished, but it was livable. Jim moved his possessions from the old cabin, carrying them in trips over several days. Lizzie's Bible, his trapping gear, cooking implements, blankets, and furs. The few items that constituted a life lived simply. On November 20th, he built the first fire in the new cabin. The day was cold, perhaps 15 degrees, with wind that made it feel colder. He started with small kindling, gradually adding larger pieces until flames filled the firebox. The stone fireplace drew well smoke rising cleanly through the chimney without backdrafting into the room. Heat radiated into the cabin space, warming the air. Within an hour, the temperature at head height reached a comfortable 60 degrees. But Jim was not watching the air temperature. He was monitoring the floor. He walked across it barefoot, feeling for warmth. Initially, the planks felt neutral, neither warm nor cold, just the temperature of wood that had been sitting in cool air. After 2 hours, they felt slightly warm when he placed his palm flat against them. After 4 hours of continuous fire, the floor was noticeably warm to the touch. He knelt and held his hand against the planks for a full minute, feeling heat radiating upward. The warmth was gentle but unmistakable. He lifted one of the access panels and reached down into the insulating cavity. The sawdust mixture was warm, several inches below the surface. Jim understood what was happening. The heat from the cabin's fire was conducting downward through the floor planks into the insulation. The stone foundation below the insulation was absorbing thermal energy from the warm air in the cavity. The massive stone was heating slowly but steadily, storing energy the way matter stores potential, holding it in molecular bonds and crystalline structures. Jim let the fire burn through the afternoon and evening. By nightfall, the entire floor was warm enough that walking on it barefoot was comfortable, almost pleasant. The stones beneath were holding heat. The insulation was trapping it. The design was functioning exactly as he had theorized. He added a final large log to the firebox around 9 in the evening, then let the fire die naturally. This was the test. If his design worked, the floor would stay warm through the night as stored heat radiated upward from the stone foundation and insulating layer. If it didn't work, he would wake to a cold cabin and would need to rethink everything. He lay on a sleeping platform wrapped in blankets and waited, listening to the fire burn down from flames to coals to ash. The air temperature in the cabin dropped as the fire reduced. By midnight, he could see his breath when he exhaled vapor forming in cool air. But the floor beneath him remained warm. He climbed down and walked across the planks in bare feet. They were cooler than they had been at sunset, but still noticeably warm, warmer than any cabin floor he had ever experienced when no fire was burning. He lay back down and slept, genuinely slept without the anxiety that had accompanied every night in the old cabin, the constant awareness that the fire needed tending, that letting it die meant danger. At dawn, he woke to a cabin that was cold but not frozen. The air temperature was perhaps 35 degrees. Outside, it was 10 below zero, a 45-degree difference between interior and exterior. And the floor was still faintly warm to the touch, warmer than the air, warmer than the walls holding on to heat that had been absorbed the previous day. Jim stood in the center of his new cabin and felt something he had not felt since Lizzie died. Not happiness exactly, but a kind of grim satisfaction. The cabin worked. The principles he had built on were sound. Heat could be stored and released. A structure could protect life even when fire failed. There was another way. He spent the rest of November experimenting with his system, treating each night as a test with variables to adjust. He varied when he let the fire die, trying evening shutdown versus midnight shutdown versus letting it burn until he went to sleep. He tried building hotter fires for shorter periods versus moderate fires for longer durations. He monitored how quickly the floor cooled and how long it retained useful warmth. He kept notes in Lizzie's old journal, recording temperatures and durations and observations about what worked best. The results were consistent and remarkable. A fire burning for 6 hours heated the floor enough to stay warm for 8 to 10 hours after the flames died. The thermal mass in the stone foundation and insulating layer acted exactly as he had theorized. Heat absorbed during the day released slowly through the night. The rate of release was gradual enough that even on the coldest nights, the floor never reached outside temperature. It would cool, but slowly giving up its stored warmth over many hours, rather than all at once. He began to understand the system's behavior in detail. The stone foundation was the key element. Those thick walls absorbed enormous amounts of heat. They warmed slowly during the day as fire heated the cabin, but once warm, they released heat for hours afterward. The insulating layer above the stones trapped that rising heat, preventing it from dissipating uselessly into frozen ground. The wooden floor absorbed warmth from the insulation and radiated it upward into the living space. The entire cabin stayed warmer than any structure Jim had previously occupied. Even when the fire was completely dead and outside temperatures dropped below zero, the interior rarely fell below 35 degrees. That was cold enough to be uncomfortable for extended periods, cold enough that he still needed blankets and warm clothes. But it was not dangerous. A person could sleep through the night without risk of freezing. More importantly, if someone was ill or injured and unable to maintain a fire, the cabin would not become a death trap. It would cool but slowly enough to give time to provide options to sustain life where the old cabin had extinguished it. Jim thought often about Lizzie during these weeks of testing and observation. The cabin he now occupied would have saved her life. If she had fallen ill in this structure instead of their previous cabin, the fire going out would not have been fatal. The temperature would have dropped but slowly controlled by thermal mass rather than by his vigilance. She would have been uncomfortable but not exposed to the lethal cold that had killed her. The knowledge brought no comfort, only the hard satisfaction of having solved a problem too late to matter for the person he had wanted to save. He did not share his results with neighbors. They still viewed his cabin as a foolish experiment, an overbuilt monument to grief. Most assumed he was struggling through the winter in a strange structure, probably regretting the time wasted on elaborate foundations and unnecessary insulation. Jim let them think what they wanted. He was warm, he was comfortable, and he was proving daily that his design worked. The validation he needed was not from other people, but from the simple fact of waking each morning in a cabin that had kept him alive through another night without constant fire tending. December arrived with heavier snow and colder temperatures. Normal winters in the Wyoming mountains were harsh by any standard. The winter of 1841 to 1842 would prove extraordinary. A cold front was building in the north, massive and slow-moving, pushing south toward the valley where Jim and his neighbors lived. The kind of cold that tested everything: structure, supplies, animals, human endurance. The kind of cold that killed without warning or mercy, finding every weakness, exploiting every gap, punishing every mistake. Jim did not know what was coming, but his cabin was ready for whatever winter could deliver. It had been built for the worst night imaginable, designed to work when everything else failed. The test would come soon enough. The temperature dropped on December 18th, not gradually but suddenly, as if something in the atmosphere had broken. Morning started at 20 below zero. By afternoon, it was 30 below. By nightfall, 40 below. Wind drove the temperature lower, still sucking heat from any exposed surface, turning metal brittle and skin white in seconds. Exposed flesh froze in less than a minute. Breath crystallized instantly into ice particles that hung in the air. The cold settled over the valley like a physical presence, heavy and malicious, finding every weakness in every structure. Sam Whitaker's family took shifts through the night. Sam tended the fire until midnight, feeding split pine into flames that roared, but barely kept the cabin at 45 degrees. Then his wife Ruth took over until dawn, her face pale with exhaustion by the time gray light appeared. Their 3 children slept in a pile near the fireplace, wrapped in every blanket the family owned, and still the youngest shivered. Even with constant fire, the cabin's temperature hovered around 42 degrees. The walls were crusted with frost on the inside. Water froze in buckets within minutes of being brought indoors. The dirt floor radiated cold upward, like frozen earth pushing into the living space. Other families in the valley faced similar struggles. Fires had to burn hot and constant. Wood consumption was enormous, unsustainable. Several families ran low on their winter supply and had to venture out in dangerous cold to cut more, risking frostbite, and worse, for armloads of fuel that would burn in hours. One trapper living alone 5 miles south made the mistake of letting his fire die while he slept. He woke at dawn, barely able to move, his body temperature dangerously low, thoughts fuzzy and slow. He managed to restart his fire and survived, but the experience terrified him. The margin between survival and death was measured in logs, in vigilance, in luck that could run out at any moment. The cold lasted 5 days. 5 days of temperatures that never rose above 20 below, often dropping to 50 below at night. 5 days of burning through wood supplies at rates that threatened to leave families without fuel before spring. 5 days of exhaustion from constant fire tending, of children crying from cold, despite being wrapped in everything warm their parents owned, of livestock freezing in barns, and game birds dropping dead from tree branches. 5 days that revealed exactly how marginal frontier survival really was, how thin the barrier between civilization and death in country this brutal. Jim's cabin performed differently. He maintained his fire during daylight hours, keeping the interior at a comfortable 60 degrees. The stone foundation absorbed heat steadily throughout the day. The floor stayed warm, radiating heat upward in a way that made the entire space feel different from other cabins. But at night, instead of loading the firebox with logs and hoping they would last until dawn, Jim let the fire die around 11. He did not stay awake to tend it. He did not set shifts or maintain vigilance. He simply let the flames burn down to coals, let the coals turn to ash, and went to sleep. The cabin cooled but slowly. The thermal mass system released stored heat at a steady rate, the temperature dropping perhaps 1 degree per hour rather than plummeting the way Sam's cabin did whenever the fire weakened. By dawn, the air temperature would be around 38 or 40 degrees, cold enough to see breath, cold enough to want a fire lit as soon as possible, but not dangerous, not the killing cold that turned cabins into ice boxes when fires died. The floor remained warm enough to walk on barefoot, the wooden planks holding heat that rose from stones below, from insulation that trapped warmth, the way a blanket trapped body heat. Jim slept through the nights without worry. No shifts to tend fire, no fear of waking frozen, no desperate calculations about wood supply lasting until spring. His cabin had transformed the relationship between fire and survival from a constant battle into a managed system. Dawn on December 21st was brutally cold. Sam had been awake most of the night, maintaining his fire, feeding it logs every hour, watching his daughter Molly shiver despite being wrapped in blankets near the hearth. His family was safe but exhausted. As gray light appeared, he decided to check on neighbors, making sure no one had frozen during the night. The cold was still savage, 50 below. Or worse, but checking was what men did. You looked after your own, even when looking meant risk. His first stop was Jim Crawford's cabin. He approached expecting to see heavy smoke from a chimney that had been burning all night. Instead, no smoke rose from Jim's chimney at all. The fire was out. Sam felt immediate alarm despite the months of giving Jim grief about his strange construction. He had called the cabin a folly, and worse, had mocked the elaborate foundation and unnecessary insulation, but he had never wished the man dead. And a cabin with no smoke in this cold meant only one thing. He dismounted 20 feet from the door and ran the last distance, boots crunching on snow that had frozen so hard it barely compressed under his weight. Before he could knock, the door opened. Jim stood in the doorway wearing a simple shirt and trousers. No heavy coat, no visible sign of distress. He looked comfortable, rested warm in ways that made no sense given the smokeless chimney and the temperature that was trying to kill everything in the valley. "Sam, you're out early. Everything all right?" The casual tone, the lack of urgency, the complete absence of the exhaustion Sam felt in his own bones, all of it registered as impossible. Sam pushed past Jim into the cabin without asking permission, needing to understand. The interior air was cool against his face, but not frozen. He could not see his breath, which meant the temperature was above freezing, probably above 40 degrees. In a cabin with no fire burning for hours. Sam's own cabin with flames roaring constantly barely maintained 45 degrees, and that only with someone tending the fire every hour. He spun toward the fireplace. Cold ash filled the firebox. No coals glowed beneath the gray powder. No heat radiated from the stones that formed the hearth and chimney. The fire had been dead for hours, maybe since midnight, maybe longer. Sam walked to the center of the cabin trying to process what he was experiencing. No second fireplace existed. No brazier burned in a corner. The walls showed no frost, unlike his own cabin, where ice crusted the interior logs despite constant fire. The window shutter was closed, but no ice had formed around its edges, no cold radiating inward the way it did through every gap in his own structure. Then he noticed warmth seeping up through his heavy boots. It was faint but present, impossible given everything else. He knelt and pulled off one glove, placed his bare palm flat against wooden floor planks. Warm. Not hot, but noticeably impossibly warm to the touch. The floor of a cabin with no fire and weather, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in under a minute, felt like sun-warmed wood in summer. Sam looked up at Jim, who stood watching with an expression that combined understanding with something that might have been relief, as if he had been waiting months for someone to discover this, to witness what he had built. How Jim walked across the cabin and knelt beside one of the floor planks. His fingers found gaps Sam had not noticed, and he lifted. The plank came up on hidden hinges, revealing darkness beneath that breathed warm air upward, like the cabin itself was exhaling. Sam moved closer and peered down into the space below the floor. He could see perhaps 2 feet down to where stone walls formed the bottom of the cavity. Between the floor and those stones, some kind of mixture filled the space dark and textured in the dim light. Sam reached his hand into the opening. 6 inches down, the material felt warm. A foot down, it was quite warm, almost uncomfortable to hold, retaining heat in a way that defied everything Sam thought he knew about how cabins worked in winter. The stone foundation absorbed heat yesterday. Jim's voice was quiet, factual, without pride or defensiveness. The insulation layer traps it, it prevents it from escaping into the frozen ground. The floor distributes the warmth upward into the cabin. Fire's been dead since 11 last night. 7 hours. Sam sat back on his heels, processing what he was seeing, what he was feeling, trying to reconcile it with a lifetime of frontier experience that said this should not be possible. His own cabin sat directly on frozen earth that stayed frozen from October through April. Heat from the fire poured downward through the dirt floor and was lost, instantly absorbed by ground that never warmed, never gave back what it took. Jim's cabin had a floor elevated 2 feet above ground level, and the space between was filled with something that trapped heat, the way root cellars trapped stable temperature, the way Tom Hayes' forge stones held warmth long after flames died. But more than trapping, the system was storing thermal energy in mass and weight in hundreds of pounds of stone that warmed slowly during the day and released that warmth slowly through the night. The insulation prevented rapid loss. The floor distributed what the stones gave back. It was engineering physics principles that made sense once explained, but that no one had thought to apply to cabin construction because survival had always been measured by vigilance, not by design. How warm does it stay? The question came out rough. Sam's throat tight with emotions he could not name. Relief that Jim was not dead. Wonder at what he was witnessing. Shame at months of mockery directed at a man who had been solving a problem while others laughed. Never below freezing, even when it's 50 below outside. Jim lowered the floor panel back into place with a soft click. I sleep through the nights, no shifts tending fire, no fear of waking frozen. Sam thought of Molly shivering at 3 in the morning, despite every blanket they owned. Thought of Ruth's exhausted face as she took over fire duties at 4. Thought of the woodpile outside, disappearing at a rate that meant they would run out long before spring arrived. His family was burning through 2 months of fuel in 10 days and barely staying warm enough to survive. Jim Crawford lived alone in comfort with a fire that burned only during waking hours and then died, releasing its captured heat slowly through the night from stones that held memory, from insulation that held warmth, from a floor that gave back what the day had stored. The difference was not the fire itself. The difference was what the cabin did with heat while it had it. Sam stood slowly, knees protesting. I need to get back to my family. He moved toward the door, then paused, words sticking in his throat before coming out. Jim, I'm sorry for the things I said about your cabin. Jim's expression did not change, his eyes still holding that look of someone who had stopped caring about opinions months ago. You called it a grave. You were half right. It's a memorial, just one that saves lives instead of marking death. The words hit Sam in the chest as he stepped out into cold that felt like a physical assault after the cabin's warmth. He mounted his horse and turned toward home, mind racing with implications. Could his own cabin be modified? Could this system be added to existing structures, or did it only work in new construction? The questions would wait. Right now, he needed to tell Ruth what he had seen, needed to describe a cabin that stayed warm with dead fire, needed to make her understand that Jim Crawford had not been crazy these past 6 months. He had been building something that should not work, but did something that changed what was possible in country this brutal. Sam returned home and found Ruth feeding their fire, her face lined with fatigue that made her look older than her 32 years. He told her what he had seen, described the warm floor and dead fire and cabin temperature that defied logic. She did not believe him at first, could not reconcile warm cabin with no smoke, could not imagine floor planks that held heat hours after flames died. But Sam's description was too detailed to dismiss, too specific to be exaggeration or mistake. By afternoon, Ruth insisted they visit Jim's cabin themselves, despite the dangerous cold, needing to see with her own eyes what her husband described. They arrived at 3 in the afternoon, bringing their 3 children, bundled in every warm thing they owned. Jim welcomed them inside, where a fire now burned. Again started that morning, the cabin comfortable at 62 degrees. But what Sam had described and what Ruth had doubted was there to feel. Jim invited everyone to place their hands on the floor to feel warmth that radiated upward. He lifted multiple access panels, showing the cavity beneath the sawdust mixture warm to the touch, the stone walls visible at the bottom, storing heat the way Sam had tried to explain. The children reacted with wonder, 10-year-old Tommy sticking his hand deep into the sawdust and pulling it back quickly. "It's warm like a blanket," 4-year-old Molly lay down on the floor and pressed her cheek against the planks. "Papa, it's warm on my face," Jim explained the system in terms they could understand. Stone walls that absorbed heat like Tom Hayes' forge, sawdust insulation from Bob Miller's waste piles, thick raised floor that distributed warmth upward. Each layer serving a purpose, working together, creating something greater than the sum of its parts. Heat conducted downward through floor planks during the day. Stone absorbed it slowly but thoroughly. Insulation trapped it, preventing loss to frozen ground. Stored warmth radiated back upward through the night, maintaining temperature that sustained life even when fire died. Ruth asked practical questions born from managing a household in brutal country. How deep are the stone walls? 18 inches thick, 2 feet deep into the ground. How long to build? 6 months working alone. What is the sawdust mixture? Half sawdust and shavings, quarter pine needles and moss, quarter crushed charcoal. Can existing cabins be modified to include this? Difficult, would need to gut the floor and excavate beneath, essentially rebuild from foundation up. Tom Hayes. The blacksmith arrived an hour later, having heard from Ruth's sister that something remarkable was happening at Jim Crawford's cabin. Tom examined the stone foundation through an access panel, running his hands over the fitted granite blocks, feeling warmth retained in mass that weighed hundreds of pounds. "This is like my forge." Same principle exactly. Dense stone holds thermal energy longer than anything else. His validation carried weight. Tom was known as someone who understood materials and heat, who had built structures that worked based on sound principles. When he confirmed that Jim's design made sense, skepticism became harder to maintain. By December 23rd, word had spread through the valley. Every family within 10 miles heard about the cabin that stayed warm without fire. Skeptics rode over to verify, despite the dangerous cold, needing to see for themselves. Each visitor felt the warm floor with dead fire visible in the hearth. Each one measured the temperature difference between interior comfort and exterior brutality. Each one left convinced that something had changed, that survival was no longer just about vigilance, that there might be another way to live through winters that killed. Bob Miller, the sawmill owner, visited and stood looking at the insulation visible through lifted floor panels. "So my garbage saves lives." His voice held wonder rather than mockery. "Your waste is the key to making this work. Without it, the system fails." Bob's expression changed, understanding, arriving that what he had considered refuse was actually valuable when used correctly. "Anyone wants sawdust? It's free forever. Take all you need." 2 trappers announced they would build new cabins in the spring using Jim's method, asking for sketches and measurements and advice on proportions. Jim drew designs on bark with charcoal, explained the ratios of stone to insulation to floor thickness, described how to seal the perimeter and create access panels, and position joists for maximum heat distribution. He charged nothing for the information, asked nothing in return, except that they build it right and keep their families safe. Sam made a public statement on December 24th at a Christmas gathering at the Trading Post, where 40 people had assembled despite the cold. He stood before the group and spoke words that cost him pride but needed saying. "I mocked Jim Crawford for 6 months, called his work a waste, a folly, a grave. I was wrong. His cabin is the only truly safe shelter in this valley." The public apology completed an arc that had begun with ridicule and ended with respect. Sam's endorsement carried weight because he had been the loudest skeptic, the one who had brought his son to see Jim's folly and used it as an object lesson in wasted effort. When Sam admitted he was wrong, others who had mocked began to reconsider their own judgments. Within days, the phrase "built like Crawford's cabin" began appearing in conversations, shorthand for construction that prioritized function over speed, that solved problems rather than accepting them, that protected life rather than just providing shelter. But the system's real test came 3 days later. Daniel Cooper lived 3 miles south of the Valley Center with his wife Martha and their 3 children aged 5, 8, and 11. On December 27th, Daniel fell through creek ice while fetching water, plunging into water so cold it stopped his heart for several beats, before adrenaline restarted it. He made it home soaked in clothing that froze stiff in the minutes it took to reach his cabin. Martha got him inside near their fire, which burned hot and constant. She stripped his frozen clothes and wrapped him in blankets, but hypothermia had already set in his core temperature, dropping despite the flames roaring 3 feet away. Daniel's body shook violently, uncontrollable tremors that made his teeth chatter and his limbs jerk. His lips turned blue. His skin felt cold and clammy. Martha piled more blankets on him, fed more wood to the fire, but the shaking continued. Their 11-year-old son, Jacob, watched his father convulse and understood with child's clarity that something was badly wrong. "Ma, he's not getting better." Martha sent Jacob on horseback to Jim's cabin, the boy riding hard through cold that hurt to breathe. He arrived at 4:30 in the afternoon, his face red with cold and fear. "Mr. Crawford, father fell in the creek. He's freezing, even by the fire. Ma says he's dying." "Is your fire burning?" "Yes, sir. But he's still shaking." She wrapped him in everything, and he won't stop shaking. "We bring him here. The floor warmth will save him." Jim saddled his horse and rode back with Jacob, arriving at the Cooper cabin to find Daniel on the dirt floor near the fire, wrapped in blankets, but still shaking violently, his eyes unfocused and speech slurred. Martha was crying. The two younger children huddled in a corner, terrified of what was happening to their father. Jim knelt and felt Daniel's forehead skin cold despite the fever-like shaking, the body trying desperately to generate heat it could not produce. "We need to move him to my cabin now. But the fire, we can't take him out in the cold again. My cabin has a warm floor. He needs heat from below, not just from the side. The floor will warm his core from underneath while fire warms from the side. Two sources better than one." They wrapped Daniel in dry blankets, Martha helping Jim hoist the shaking man onto Jim's horse. Jim mounted behind Daniel, holding him upright against his chest. Jacob led Martha and the two younger children on a second horse, a dangerous ride in brutal cold, but more dangerous to stay. The journey took 25 minutes that felt like hours. Daniel's shaking transmitted through his body into Jim's arms, proof of life but barely. They arrived at Jim's cabin and carried Daniel inside, laying him directly on the warm floor near the fireplace, but not touching the hot stones. Jim had built up the fire before leaving the interior at 65 degrees, the floor radiating stored warmth upward. They removed the damp blankets and wrapped Daniel in dry ones from Jim's sleeping platform. 3 sources of heat now worked on his body. Warm floor radiating from below, the heat conducted through blankets into his core. Fireplace radiating from the side, warming his torso and face. Warm air from above 65 degrees instead of the 40 degrees of the Cooper cabin. The combined effect was what Daniel's body needed. 20 minutes after being placed on the warm floor, the violent shaking began to slow. 30 minutes and the tremors had reduced to occasional shivers. 45 minutes and the shaking stopped completely. Daniel's breathing steadying, color returning to his lips. 1 hour and he was conscious enough to speak words thick and slow but coherent. "The floor, it's warm, like something underneath is holding me." Martha knelt beside her husband, tears running down her face but smiling now. "You're going to be all right. The cabin saved you." The Cooper family stayed 2 days while Daniel recovered fully. The children marveled at the warm floor, playing games that involved lying on the planks and feeling heat radiate upward. Martha watched her husband regain strength and understood with absolute clarity that they would be planning a funeral right now if Jim Crawford had not built a cabin that worked differently than every other structure in the valley. On the second evening, as Daniel sat up and ate solid food, Martha spoke words that carried weight beyond their simplicity. "You saved my husband's life. You saved my children's father." Jim thought of Lizzie, of waking to find her cold, and still of understanding too late that the cabin had failed her. Couldn't save her, but saved him. The cabin works. The Cooper family left on the 3rd day, Daniel strong enough to ride. Word of the rescue spread faster than news of the warm floor had spread. Jim's innovation was now proven not just as comfort, but as life-saving necessity. The cabin had kept a man alive who would have died from hypothermia despite being near a roaring fire in a conventional structure. The difference was the floor, the heat source below, that warmed core body temperature the way air heat and fire heat could not. January and February brought more families to see the cabin, to feel the warm floor, to ask questions about construction. Jim answered everything honestly, sharing measurements and materials and techniques without reservation. By spring of 1842, 5 families had begun planning new cabins using Jim's method. The phrase built like Crawford's cabin spread beyond the immediate valley, carried by trappers and traders who moved between settlements, by families who wrote letters to relatives in other territories describing the innovation. Within a year, variations of Jim's thermal floor system appeared in Montana and Colorado, adaptations based on available materials, but maintaining the core principle. Stone foundation for thermal mass, insulation to trap heat, raised floor to distribute warmth. By 1847, the fur trade was collapsing. Beaver populations had been trapped out across much of the Rockies. Fashion had shifted from felt hats to silk, destroying demand for pelts. The economic foundation of the mountain man era was crumbling. Men who had spent decades in the wilderness were returning to civilization or moving to new territories where different opportunities existed. Jim was 42 years old, had been alone for 7 years since Lizzie died. The valley that had been home felt increasingly empty as families moved on and trappers gave up on a trade that no longer sustained them. He decided to leave that summer to try a different life in Oregon Territory, where land was available and farming was possible. A family moving west, the Bennetts expressed interest in buying his cabin. William Bennett was 32 with a pregnant wife, Sarah, and 2 young children. They arrived in June to look at the property. Jim showed them the insulation cavity beneath the floor, still functional after 6 years, the sawdust mixture dry and intact. He explained how to maintain the system optimal fire patterns for maximum heat storage. William listened carefully. Sarah stood in the cabin, feeling the difference even in summer, the interior cooler than outside air, the structure working in reverse, now keeping heat out rather than holding it in. This cabin feels special, like it was built with more than just skill. It was built so no one else would die like my wife did. Built to work when the person inside can't. Sarah saw Jim's eyes mist and understood that she was not buying just a structure, but a memorial, a promise kept to someone who had died before the promise could save her. She'd be proud of what you made here. Jim left the cabin to the Bennetts with a note tucked into Lizzie's Bible. Keep the floor warm. Keep your family safe. As Sam rode over on Jim's final day in the valley. I'm sorry I called you crazy. You called it a grave. You were half right. It's a memorial that keeps people alive instead of just marking where they died. They shook hands, words insufficient to cover 6 years of changed understanding. Jim mounted his horse and rode east toward the Oregon Trail, leaving behind a cabin that would shelter families for another 77 years. Jim homesteaded in Oregon's Willamette Valley, married Rebecca Turner in 1849, and had 2 sons. He died peacefully in 1871 at age 66. 2 months later, a letter arrived from Sam Whitaker. Mrs. Crawford, your husband saved my daughter Molly in December 1841. His cabin saved the Cooper family and many others. Over 30 years, we estimate his design saved at least 22 lives. The cabin still stands. Your husband changed how we survive. The valley owes him a debt we can never repay. In 1924, when the cabin was finally torn down, engineers found initials carved under an access panel, JC plus EC, 1841. Below it, the Bennett family had added, "This floor kept us warm, 1847 to 1887. Thank you, James." The 3 layers had never been just stone and sawdust and wood. They had been memory and purpose and love, made solid, built to hold heat, but also to hold meaning, to transform grief into protection, proving that sometimes the best response to loss is not acceptance, but innovation.